Welcome to the Alabama Renaissance Fair.
Okay, very good. Well, welcome everyone to the third in the Alabama Renaissance Fair, University of North Alabama and Florence Lauderdale Public Libraries lecture series. My name is Lee Freeman. I'm with the Board of Directors of the Alabama Renaissance Fair. We have 2 or 3 other Alabama Renaissance Fair Roundtable members with us. We feasted at Her Majesty's Royal Autumn Feast last night, so there was much rejoicing and gladness of heart, but we were very weary. So I'll point of Monty Python. There was much rejoicing and gladness of heart, but we're tired. But we're glad everybody came. Last week, the first week, Dr. John Golich did a program on medieval and Renaissance gaming, which was really interesting. Good way to kick us off. Last week, Dr. Carl Franks, a board member of the Alabama Renaissance Fair from UNA's English department, did a program on medieval depictions of the Book of Revelation. That was fantastic. So I'm very much looking forward to this week's presentation as well. We've been doing this lecture series, the Alabama Renaissance Fair has, probably since day one. Definitely since I've been on the board, and this is our 39th year, and I've been with them like 37 or 35 of the 39. It's a long time. So we've been doing this series a long time. One of our goals is education as well as, having fun. So we stress obviously the fun aspect, but the educational and artistic aspects of it. One reason they picked October to do a Renaissance Fair in town, an all-volunteer nonprofit fair, which for an all-volunteer nonprofit fair to go 39 years is pretty extraordinary. And that's largely to the founders, chiefly Billy Warren, who's still with us. He's our fearless leader. I thought he might be here today, but something might have come up. But they picked October because it was statistically one of the driest months, yet most temperate months of the year without a lot of bad weather. And it was also during the school year where they could tie the Renaissance Fair in with curricula, medieval European history, English literature, Shakespeare, Beowulf, anything medieval Renaissance. And so here we are. The whole month of October is Renaissance month. We do a series of medieval Renaissance themed events all month, 3 lectures each Sunday leading up to the fair. Her Majesty's Royal Autumn Feast was last night. It's always the 3rd weekend, and then the fair itself the 4th weekend. So come out and make merry with us at Fountain on the Green, aka Wilson Park, where we will have some revels. One of the things, as I said, that the Alabama Renaissance Fair stresses, and I'm on the education committee of the board, and it's very important to us, is education. So this lecture series, the one way we keep because Renaissance fairs, you all have who's been to our fair or other Renaissance fairs, well as Dr. Mikowski of UNA's history department, which will be doing medieval archery behind the Kennedy Douglas Art Center, so come shoot some longbows and crossbows with us. He says Renaissance fairs are catch-alls for anything old. Well, they also are catch-alls for anything, fantasy. You're liable to see hobbits. Somebody may ask, where's Xena the Warrior Princess or Hercules? So we try to keep our fair grounded in actual medieval Renaissance history. One way we do that is with this lecture series. So we're pleased today to have Dr. Stephane Coker of the University of North Alabama Languages Department, Associate Professor of French, as our speaker. Her academic, this is her curriculum vitae. This is double-sided, but it's still very impressive. She got, and I won't read all of it, I'll just go over the highlights. She got her BA in French at Mississippi College in 2000, her MA in French in 2004 at LSU, and in 2007, her Ph.D. in French at LSU. She got a professional superior rating oral proficiency interview. It's a very impressive resume. She's written several articles, including Joan of Arc as an archetype, teaching the maid abroad, online and in film festivals, and that's in the Studies in Medieval and Renaissance Teaching, which is forthcoming. At this point, it was forthcoming in 2024. It's probably out already. Have to find that if I can. Very impressive resume. Thrilled to have her. Joan of Arc is one of my favorite medieval Renaissance characters, a medieval character. So her program today will be Joan of Arc, Medieval Maiden, her life, legacy, and what's at stake. And I love the title. So please welcome Dr. Stephanie Coker.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. I know you can be a lot of places on a Sunday, so I appreciate being here. And thank you for that introduction as well. I do want to beg your pardon as we start. I do have my notes today. I know there's so much to say about Joan of Arc that I thought this is to help keep me on track. I have a lot of images I wanted to share with you. So first off, well, as you know, I teach French at UNA. In fact, I see a couple of my students. Bonjour. Thank you guys for coming. Thanks for being here. But as we get started, I thought it would be helpful to share a little bit about my work, aside from what Lee has mentioned already, and my interest in Joan of Arc. So as a graduate student teaching English abroad in France, I read a biography on Joan and began exploring key sites along her journey. So this experience led me to writing my doctoral dissertation on how French authors have retold Joan's story across the centuries. So today, what I have planned for us is to look at Joan of Arc in history. So let's see. So this is kind of where we're headed today, looking at Joan in history and also examine her legacy as we grapple with what's at stake, pun intended. As you see, we'll begin with the early years, Joan's military exploits and her trials. In the latter half, we'll discuss Joan's treatment in literature and on screen, and we'll see various memorials to the Maid before we conclude with her prevalence in popular culture. And also, I'll save some time near the end if folks want to ask any questions or if we have further discussion. We'll have time for that. And by the way, the image you see here is one made of Joan during her lifetime and is found in the Parliament Register in Paris in the 1420s. And she was a figure drawn in the margins there. Joan, the early years. So Joan was born January 6, 1412, and her birthplace was Domremy. It's a small village in eastern France. She was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romée. So here is a photo of her childhood home in Domremy, and that you can visit it today. It is now a museum, and I got the chance to visit in 2012, so that's a photo. And then you see as well from the map the placement of Domremy there in the eastern part of France, not far from Strasbourg, and then you're getting close to the border of Germany. Interestingly, you'll see on the map it has been renamed now. It is called Domremy la Pucelle, after Joan. So its official name is Domremy la Pucelle. Now her name in French is Jeanne d'Arc, and you'll sometimes see it spelled Jeanne with the H in the Middle French of the 15th century. And she's also often referred to as Jeanne la Pucelle, right? So that means Joan the Maiden. And this was a designation that Joan herself used. At a young age, around 13, Joan begins to hear voices of Saint Michael, the Archangel, Catherine, Marguerite, and the Archangel Gabriel, who gave her instructions at that time about praying and going often to church. The painting you see here on the right is the first in a series of 4 large frescoes depicting Joan's life by the artist Jules de Nepveu, and they are on display inside the Pantheon in Paris. And just to give you an idea of the scale, these murals are massive. They're about 15 feet in height, and so that's why I've included that photo there. That's inside the Pantheon. I don't know if anybody has been to the Pantheon, if you've seen these murals. It's a really great depiction of like the life of Joan of Arc. You kind of walk along and you see these 4 large murals, and then there's 4 little frescoes at the top as well. Let's see. So the first one here is the young Joan, the shepherdess, who is hearing her voices. And at this stage, it is important to note the historical context. The country was divided during the 100 Years' War, and succession to the French throne was disputed. France had suffered a devastating loss to the English in 1415 at the Battle of Agincourt, and 2 factions arose at this time: the Armagnacs, who supported Charles VII as the next rightful king, and the Burgundians, who were allied with the English in support of Henry VI. And the map shows the northern part of France under Anglo-Burgundian control, and then the area south of Orléans that was loyal to Charles VII. So these politics set the stage for Joan of Arc and were the backdrop for her life when she first comes on the scene. And as she grew, her mission was made clearer by her voices. It was, 1, to see the Dauphin Charles crowned king, and by the way, that term Dauphin is a way of indicating the heir. That was the title given. So the Dauphin Charles crowned king, and secondly, her mission was essentially to kick the English out of France. And as a first step, Joan must visit the nearby town of Vaucouleurs to gain the support of a French nobleman, Robert de Baudricourt. And here's an image of Vaucouleurs taken during my visit in 2012. You can still see these old remains there in the town. In persuading Baudricourt to support her, Joan continued on to the village of Chinon to meet the Dauphin. As the story goes, he tried to hide among the courtiers, but Joan, having never met Charles, was able to pick him out of the crowd. And this event perhaps helped to convince the Dauphin of Joan's mission and substantiate her claims of hearing divine voices. And these photos taken in 2003 capture the remains of the Great Room in the Chateau of Chinon, where Joan met Charles in February of 1429. She would have been 17 at this point. Shortly after, Joan made her way to the town of Poitiers, where she was examined by theologians in March and April of 1429. There, she was questioned about her voices and also examined physically in order to confirm her virginity and thus authenticate her claim as Pucelle, that she really was the Maiden. This picture, taken in 2005, you can see the memorial to Joan that actually stands behind this cathedral in Poitiers. After Joan's examination, Charles gives his full support, providing her with soldiers and armor. In a relatively short period of time, Joan has quite a few military exploits, including success at Orléans, Jargeau, Mans, Beaugency, Patay, Troyes, and Lagny. So this image is taken from my colleague Scott Manning's website, where he maps out Joan's victories and losses. And among these military successes is probably the most notable, and that is Orléans. So on May 8, 1429, the siege was lifted at Orléans, and this is a turning point for the French in the Hundred Years' War, as they started to gain momentum in reclaiming territories that were held by the English. It is this one that is the greatest triumph of Joan's military campaign, as the city of Orléans had been under siege for about 7 months. And from the map here, you'll note its placement as the northernmost city that remained loyal to Charles. And on the right, this is another painting by Jules Lenepveux in his series of 4 frescoes in the Pantheon. And this one depicting Joan's remarkable victory at Orléans. As a result, the success at Orléans leads to more victories for Joan in the Loire campaign, and ultimately takes her to the city of Reims, where Charles was crowned king. Joan was present at the coronation on July 17, 1429. And this painting by Lenepveux depicts Charles on his knees receiving the crown, while the maid is standing beside him with her banner and sword. And on the right is a photo I took in 2012 when I visited Reims, and you see a statue of Joan of Arc on horseback near the entrance to the cathedral. In examining the maid's military career, we find that she did experience losses, right, including the cities of Paris, where she was wounded in September 1429, also in La Charité, in Choisy-au-Bac, and finally in Compiègne, where she was captured in May of 1430. The photo on the right was taken when I visited Compiègne in 2018, and Compiègne is a small city just north of Paris, not far. Following Joan's capture by the Burgundians at Compiègne, she is imprisoned at Beaurevoir. She is sold to the English and ultimately brought to Rouen for her trial. Here's a photo taken during my visit to Rouen in 2012, and this city is significant in Joan's story because it is her final stop. This is where the full trial will take place in Rouen. And I love visiting these cities in France because you see this kind of juxtaposition of the medieval next to the modern, and it's really, really interesting. From January to May 1431, Joan was tried as a heretic in Rouen. On the left, you see a photo of the old market square where Joan was executed. And there is a sign indicating in 3 languages, so it's in French, in English, and in German, that this is the location where she was burned. Today, you'll also find a church that has been built right beside the square. On the right is another painting by Lenepveux showing Joan at the stake. Regarding Joan's trial in Rouen, the numerous charges brought against her include wearing men's clothing, claiming to have divine visions, defying the church, sorcery, and blasphemy. Thanks to the trial transcripts, we have access to Joan's testimony, and we can see how she was questioned. It's interesting to note that despite her examiner's attempt at trying to trap her, Joan evades their cunning questions. One of the most famous lines from the transcripts is when they ask Joan if she is in a state of grace, to which she replies, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Thus, she confounded her judges with eloquence, despite her humble status as an illiterate teenager. Near the end of the trial, we learn of Joan's abjuration, when, for fear of the fire, she renounced her visions to save her life. Soon after, though, she recanted, changing back into men's clothing, and she was declared a relapsed heretic. As a result, she was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431. And the painting on the left depicts Joan at the trial, and it's by artist Paul de la Roche from 1824. Joan's first trial is known as the Trial of Condemnation, which resulted in her execution in 1431 at the age of 19. A few years later, there would be a second trial known as the Rehabilitation Trial or the Nullification Trial in 1456, which was a posthumous retrial that annulled the sentence. It was not until centuries later, though, that the church formally recognized Joan when she was beatified in 1909 and canonized in 1920, becoming Saint Joan of Arc, almost 500 years after her death. Her feast day is celebrated on May 30th. And the photo on the right shows a memorial to Joan in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which is where the rehabilitation trial took place. This statue is by French sculptor Charles de Vergne and was commissioned after her canonization in 1920. So we'll switch gears a little bit. I know we talked about Joan in history. Now we're going to move into the legacy portion, beginning with literature. So although Joan died at 19, her legacy lives on. Nearly 6 centuries after Joan's death, storytellers such as authors and filmmakers, well beyond the borders of France, have been compelled to give an account of the Maid of Orleans. One of the first authors, Christine de Pizan, was a contemporary of Joan, writing in 15th century France. During the Maid's lifetime, Pizan penned her epic poem, The Tale of Joan of Arc. It was called the Dittier de Jeanne d'Arc, immediately after Charles VII's coronation in Reims in 1429. This was the poet's final work, her swan song, and it served to rally the French people in support of the newly crowned sovereign, and also to celebrate Joan's extraordinary feats. In stanza 34, she writes, quote, "Oh, what honor for the female sex! It is perfectly obvious that God has special regard for it, when all these wretched people who destroyed the whole kingdom, now recovered and made safe by a woman, something that 5,000 men could not have done. And the traitors have been exterminated. Before the event, they would scarcely have believed this possible." Voltaire, writing in the 18th century, wrote a mock epic poem about Joan of Arc. This scandalous satire was described as a bawdy burlesque, and the text was banned and burned in Europe. It's interesting that his text on Joan was burned. And then subsequently there were other versions, there were edited versions that were published later as well. In the 20th century, shortly after World War II, French playwright Jean Anouilh wrote The Lark, or L'Alouette in French, that was performed in Paris in 1953. This work is a play within a play where Joan reenacts key moments in her life, like the trial and the condemnation. But it has a surprise conclusion when the actors reorder events to give the Maid a triumphant ending at the king's coronation. So all of this is going on in France, and honestly, I've only picked just a few, right, to give you a sampling, but there are many, many texts that you'll find about Joan in France. But now let's go beyond the borders of France. So just a few of the non-French authors. So outside France, many others were writing about Joan of Arc. In America, Mark Twain penned his novel, Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc, in 1896. Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw wrote about the Maid in his famous drama called St. Joan, 1923. And even German author Friedrich Schiller penned a play on Joan, somebody help me with the German, Die Jungfrau von Orleans, maybe? The Maid of Orleans. That premiered in 1801. So those are a few other literary accounts of Joan. But now let's talk about film and TV. The Maid's legacy also continues on screen. Aside from the various documentaries about her life, Joan has been the subject of many, many movies. Today I'll mention only a few films, beginning with 3 that we've screened in recent years on campus at the UNA French Film Festival. The first one you see there, Carl Theodor Dreyer directed The Passion of Joan of Arc, La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc, in 1928. This was a silent film starring René Falconetti, whose portrayal of Joan is perhaps the most celebrated. The second poster is from the film Jeannette, The Childhood of Joan of Arc, which was a rock musical from 2017, directed by Bruno Dumont, and starring Lise Le Plat Prud'homme and Jeanne Voisin as Joan. And the filmmaker Dumont made a second movie about the Maid in 2019, and his film Joan of Arc, starring the same actress, Prud'homme, was a continuation of Joan's story after her childhood, and it focused on the trial. And I'm curious, has anyone seen these films, the Dreyer film or either of the Dumont films? Okay. Because I thought perhaps we could take a moment, and I want to show you a clip from the Dreyer film. Let's see. Right here. Just to give you a sampling of see what Dreyer's film is like. Thoughts? What do you guys think of the depiction of Joan in Dreyer's film?
It's definitely got the emotional. Even without the music, I think the emotion would still come through, but that score
It really adds a lot.
really adds to it.
Yes, yes. And the score he's referring to, that is Richard Einhorn's score, Voices of Light, that was added much later, I think composed in the late 20th century. So it was,
Yeah, in fact, I've got that recording. It was playing when everybody came
That's
in,
right,
so it's
when
just
you
like
came
10 or 15 years old, that recording.
And as you mentioned too, we see the emotion of Joan in that, in the film, and that's one thing that Dreyer's film is kind of known for. He's got these incredible close-ups on the actors, which was kind of an unconventional thing at the time. And so his film is probably, as I say, one of the most celebrated.
And it's a miracle that copies of it even survived. It's kind of like
That's right.
Nosferatu. It's a miracle any copies of that survived. But I think they found a good workable copy at a Norwegian mental hospital that they were able to.
Right.
Yeah.
We thought the film had been lost, and then it was recovered there. So yeah, it's a miracle that we even have this film. That's right. That's right. All right. Well, let's continue with a few other French filmmakers. Since the very beginning of cinema, Joan of Arc has been a top choice for directors. In 1900, Georges Méliès made a short film, Joan of Arc, and it's about 10 minutes long, starring Jeanne Calvière. In 1962, another French filmmaker, Robert Bresson, made his movie, The Trial of Joan of Arc, Procès de Jeanne d'Arc, starring Florence as Joan. And in 1994, Jacques Rivette made a two-part feature, Joan the Maid, The Battles and the Prisons, starring Sandrine Bonnaire. And that one is like two feature films. So you've got one focusing on the battles, one on the prisons. So those are just a few of the French filmmakers, but we also have representations of Jeanne in America, right? So the Hollywood Joans, Cecil B. DeMille made a movie called Joan the Woman in 1916, starring Geraldine Farrar. And director Victor Fleming created his own Joan of Arc in 1948, starring Ingrid Bergman. And in 1999, Luc Besson's controversial take on Joan was called The Messenger and starred the actress Mila Jovovich. I don't know if anybody has seen any of those.
Yeah.
Yes. The Messenger, I feel like, was pretty popular, again, and not too many years ago, but also a very controversial take on Joan because we were talking about this prior to the lecture starting. But this one is the one that has Dustin Hoffman, Faye Dunaway. There's some names that you would recognize in the movie, but Dustin Hoffman plays this character where he's the conscience of Joan, and he's wearing this black hood, and he's asking her questions, and it really makes us as the viewer kind of question Joan's sanity. Did she really hear the voice of God, or was she going crazy? So this one is interesting as well. But let's talk now about Joan on TV. In America, we've seen several iterations of the Maid story on television. The Lark in 1957 was an adaptation of Jean Anouilh's French play L'Alouette that I mentioned earlier. It starred Julie Harris, and the teleplay aired on NBC Hallmark Hall of Fame. And in 1999, Christian Duguay directed the TV miniseries Joan of Arc, starring Lili Sobieski. That's the one in the middle there. And the third image was a promotion piece for Joan of Arcadia, the TV series created by Barbara Hall that originally aired on CBS from 2003 to 2005, starring Amber Tamblyn, the actress Amber Tamblyn. And here you'll notice the tagline on the poster, "What if you were chosen to make a difference?" So the show's premise centers around Joan, an American teenager in high school who gets a message or a mission from God in each episode. And it's usually to help someone in need, whether that's in her school or in her community. She's always getting a message from God. But God does show up in different forms. So she's always trying to figure out who is the messenger from God in that episode. It's really an interesting show. I don't know if anybody has seen Joan of Arcadia. After it aired on CBS, it replayed on other networks. So it's out there in some places. All right. Moving to the next portion, Joan for Children, question mark, all right. So creators have also reinterpreted Joan's story for younger audiences. The Simpsons episode, Tales from the Public Domain, attempts to rewrite the ending for the Maid. So when the kids ask if they really burned Joan of Arc, the mother, Marge, she snatches up the book they are reading, tells them that Joan was rescued by Sir Lancelot and got married.
Yeah, it's about right.
In 2019, Stephen Ritz-Barr created his film, The Legend of Joan of Arc, using puppets or marionettes. And that was a feature film, too. And on public television, the children's series Wishbone was about a dog who dreams of being the lead character in classic literature. So in that episode, Bone of Arc, from 1995, Wishbone the dog discusses Mark Twain's novel, the one I mentioned earlier, The Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. So he mentions Mark Twain's novel as he parallels it with a modern-day storyline of a young girl who's facing challenges when she learns about bravery and sacrifice. So at this point, we'll switch gears a little bit to talk about some of the memorials to Joan. Now, we've seen a few depictions of Joan on screen and literature. Let's consider memorials to the Maid. Beginning in Paris, one can find statues in many, many churches throughout the French capital. So a moment ago, we saw the one in Notre Dame. That was the one, like I said, that we think about because the rehabilitation trial had happened there. But let's look at a few more. So here on the left is a smaller statue inside the Église Notre Dame des Blancs-Manteaux, which is a Catholic church in the 4th district of Paris. The artist depicts Joan in a long robe rather than armor, and she's holding a sword close to her face. The Maid's standard is missing, and I assume this is the saintly Joan, as her head is surrounded by what appears to be a halo. In the middle, we see a sculpture found inside the Église Saint-Roch, located on the Rue Saint-Honoré in the 1st district, so that would be right in the center of Paris. This unique statue depicts Joan walking or perhaps marching, and the Maid is wearing a long flowing skirt, and she looks upward with her hands clasped while she holds her standard. Her sword is strapped behind her, and she wears armor but no helmet. And that may be her helmet just below her, right under her, next to her feet there. It's kind of hard to tell, but we think that might be her helmet. On the right is a work dated 1912 by André Bescu entitled Joan at the Coronation. Located inside the Église Saint-Étienne-du-Mont in the Latin Quarter, this sculpture shows the Maid wearing armor but without her banner and her helmet. The armor is covered by a long tunic with a detailed fleur de lis. Joan grasps her sword and looks straight ahead with a serious and solemn expression. Her hair is short, and she appears boyish, as we might expect. So continuing in Parisian churches, on the left you see the statue of the Maid located inside the Église Notre-Dame de la Gare, situated in the 13th district, and it's actually located on the Joan of Arc square. The sculpture depicts a very feminine Joan with long hair and a long flowing dress or robe. She grasps her sword with both hands, her eyes are closed, and her expression is serene. In the middle, this statue is placed outside the St. Joan of Arc Basilica in the 18th district. Made by the French sculptor Félix Champpartier and dated 1890, she is dressed in armor without a helmet and has her sword at her left side. She carries her standard over her left shoulder. Her expression is serious, and her gaze seems to be straight ahead. Inside the basilica, I found a sculpture unlike any other I had seen in Paris. Having grown accustomed to depictions of the warrior Joan or the saintly Joan with her sword or her banner, I was surprised to find a statue of Joan at the stake. With her head tilted back, Joan's eyes appear to be closed as smoke billows around her. I will also call your attention to the strategic placement of the fire extinguisher just behind the statue of Joan of Arc at the stake. I thought, wow, how ironic. So also within the 18th district is the well-known Sacred Heart Church, the Sacré-Cœur. I don't know if anybody has visited Sacré-Cœur, but this one, there's actually many references and memorials kind of to Joan there. So first, on the left, you see towering above the passers-by, we find Joan on horseback with her sword raised. This bronze statue by Hippolyte Lefebvre, dated 1927, depicts Joan in full armor, perhaps leading soldiers into battle. Here, a masculine-looking Joan peers straight ahead with a serious and determined expression. Inside the Sacred Heart Basilica, we find an area or chapel to honor St. Michael the Archangel, and it features a statue of the Maid kneeling in prayer. This is what's seen in the middle, as well as some beautiful stained glass windows on the right. And I thought we would take a closer look at the stained glass windows. So they also tell the story of Joan of Arc. On the right, the glass shows the young maiden, and the words indicate Joan hears her voices. Right at the bottom, it says, Jeanne entend ses voix. In the middle, we find the scene of Joan taking communion, and it reads, quote, I am sent by God to bring down the siege of Orleans and to lead the king to Reims. So at the top, it looks as if she's kneeling and receiving a blessing, and then at the very bottom, it looks like she's receiving the communion. And on the left-hand side, the window reveals the maid's final moments, and it reads, quote, Joan at the stake, Jeanne sur le bûcher. At the Place Saint-Augustin in the 8th district stands an equestrian statue. So we'll look at a couple more equestrian statues. This one by French sculptor Paul Dubois was erected in 1900 and shows Joan dressed in full armor with the right hand raising her sword. Joan appears to be riding into battle. And this original statue is the one at Reims that we saw a few moments ago when we saw the picture of the cathedral. And so the copy of it is here in Paris. On the right is perhaps the most famous statue of Joan in Paris, located at the Place des Pyramides in the 1st district. So this is right near the Louvre Museum and the Tuileries Garden. This sculpture by Emmanuel Fremier is visible to many tourists who visit the French capital. The gilded bronze sculpture was commissioned by Napoleon III in 1874 and reworked in 1899. It depicts Joan riding in a procession, perhaps in a procession, carrying her standard, not her sword, in her right hand. Joan wears full armor, but no helmet, and thus her long flowing hair is on display. Replicas of the sculpture can also be found in Nancy, France, which is, again, eastern part of France, not too far from where Joan was born in Domremy. But you'll find another replica in Melbourne, Australia, and in the US, we have one in New Orleans, there's one in Philadelphia, and in Portland. Seen by many tourists, this statue also carries significance for local Parisians as it was the site of political rallies by the far-right National Front Party. The Front National, founded in 1972, is known for its anti-immigration policies, and they often appropriated Joan as a sort of mascot. Jean-Marie Le Pen, who lost to Jacques Chirac in the 2002 presidential election, was the first leader, and he served until 2011 when he resigned, and his daughter, Marine Le Pen, took over as head of the party. She ran for president in 2012, and then again later as well, in 2017. And the two images here from the web are taken during a campaign speech. The Fremier statue figures prominently behind Marine and suggests that she is the new female warrior to save France. In a talk, Elizabeth Willis noted the juxtaposition of the two women made by the former party leader, Jean-Marie Le Pen. In the closing words of his speech in May 2012, he established the women's common mission as defenders of the nation and finished his speech with Vive Jeanne, Vive Marine, Vive la France. So long live Joan, long live Marine, his daughter, and long live France. And also, as you see here, there's a poster that was the Front National advertising their annual gathering to celebrate Joan's feast day. And they incorporate the silhouette of the Maid statue, the Fremier statue. So in the 13th district, visitors are perhaps surprised to find many references to Joan and her life story throughout the neighborhood. So we've seen a lot of them in churches, right, and in public squares, but you'll find other references to Joan elsewhere. So near the church Notre-Dame de la Gare, I saw many street signs and businesses that pay homage to the Maid and her life. There are streets named for key cities such as Domremy, Pâté, and Reims, as well as key players and Joan's comrades like Dunois, La Hire, and Zontrailles. And local businesses like the pastry shop bear Joan's name, as well as the square. You see the Place Jeanne d'Arc. There's even a bar, cafe, named for the Maid, and her name appears on the neighborhood post office. You see the Paris Jeanne d'Arc. Right. So out in the square, but also you'll find her, as you would expect, in the traditional museums, right? Joan can be found in the popular museums of Paris, such as the Orsay Gallery and the Louvre Museum. The image on the left reveals a marble statue by Henri Chaput, entitled Joan of Arc at Domremy, from 1870, depicting the Maid in her hometown as a young shepherdess. And the photo on the right was taken in the Louvre, and it highlights a marble statue from 1852 by François Rude that shows Joan listening to her voices. And I love how she's grasping the suit of armor behind her. That's one of my favorites. But outside Paris, one can find memorials to the Maid, especially in the city of Orléans, France, the town that she delivered from the English enemy. Along with statues, there are many sites that refer to Joan, such as, once again, we see another pastry shop pictured here, but there are many, many places throughout the city of Orléans. In fact, where I stayed was the Hotel d'Arc, so everything is almost an homage to Joan. Likewise, the city of New Orleans pays homage to Joan of Arc. On the left, in the French Quarter, is the copy of the Fremier statue that we just saw in Paris. And New Orleans is home as well to the Cru de Jeanne d'Arc, who host an annual Mardi Gras parade in January to honor Joan, and they select a local girl to play the role of Joan during the festivities. The group was established in 2008 by founder Amy Kirk Duvoisin. And in addition to the parade and other events, they organize a Joan of Arc conference every fall. And recently, the crew made news when in 2025, so earlier this year, they chose to march on January the 6th. So that's when they always have their parade. But if you remember, that was when a terrorist attack had just happened in New Orleans. There was the man who drove his truck into the crowd of people in Bourbon Street. And so there was a question of, will the parade go on? And they did. They chose to march. In many ways, the Joan Parade in New Orleans reminds us of the long-standing Joan of Arc festival that happens in Orléans, France in May. The annual Fête Jeanne d'Arc includes parades, markets, concerts, and spectacles. A committee selects a local maiden to play the famous role, and she leads a procession of military, clergy, and local dignitaries, among others, through the streets of Orléans. The festival, with its customs and pageantry, is an enduring tradition. And very recently, by the way, these two cities have kind of started a new tradition where they will send their respective Joan to participate in the local festivities of the other. So at each of these festivals now, there is the American Joan and the French Jeanne who participate. Memorials to the Maid are not only present in France and the US. On a trip to Canada, I discovered the Joan of Arc Garden in Quebec City with a statue honoring the Maiden. Also, I found in Rome, Italy, Joan was in the French church. This is the Chiesa San Luigi dei Francesi. That I found this one in Rome this summer, so it was really close to the doorway. Right as you enter, you can find Joan. So she is everywhere. So Joan's enduring presence is undeniable, and her ubiquitous nature can even be seen in popular culture. Aside from the TV shows that I mentioned, such as Joan of Arcadia, I want to point out just a few notable examples. Here you see in 1913, the Ringling Brothers created a spectacle centered around the life of Joan of Arc. This pre-show performance included 1,200 characters and lasted 45 minutes before the circus began. On the right, in the modern era, Joan of Arc became a video game, Jeanne d'Arc, from 2006. During wartime, Joan's image was used on posters, such as Haskell Coffin's in 1918, that reads, "Joan of Arc saved France, women of America save your country, buy war-saving stamps." And Joan has inspired other artists, including fashion designers, like Balenciaga, whose fall collection in 2023, so just a couple of years ago, featured the Joan of Arc dress that was 3D printed armor. And also that was recently on display in the Louvre. They had a fashion exhibit that one could kind of go through the different sections of the Louvre, and they did have this dress on display. Musicians and songwriters have also drawn inspiration from the Maid. Leonard Cohen wrote a song called Joan of Arc in 1971, and Madonna had a song by the same title on her album in 2015. On the right-hand side, you'll see a photo taken from a rock musical in 2017. It was called Joan of Arc Into the Fire, and it played off-Broadway in New York. And last year, pop singer Chappell Roan emulated Joan in her performance at the VMAs. So that photo in the center, that's from 2024. I call it Roan as Joan, right? Because she's performing as Joan of Arc, although the song that she performed really didn't have anything to do with Joan of Arc, but it's interesting that her whole performance, she was emulating Joan, and then she has a whole series of background dancers that are dressed as medieval soldiers, and then you can see even in the photo, there's all these pyrotechnics, all the fire behind her. So it's an interesting choice. So her prevalence in pop culture can even be seen in Joan-related products. One business, Catholic Coffee, has a French blend called Saint Joan of Arc. This kind of brings new meaning to the term French roast, I guess. Right. There is also a scented candle, Joan of Arc. This too I find alarming because the product requires one to light Joan on fire. But lastly, the image is present, the one you see here is present in our local grocery store. On the shelves we find Joan of Arc chili beans. Right? So as I said, she's everywhere. So in conclusion, the Maid of Orleans was an extraordinary young woman in history, and as a result, the Joan of Arc phenomenon has endured and has a broad public appeal. In teaching about Joan in my classes, I witness how often people connect with her in different ways. Right? For the feminist, she represents the triumph of woman. For the spiritual, the Maid embodies self-sacrifice and devotion to God. Her martyrdom even renders her a Christ-like figure. To the humble, she demonstrates the potential to rise above social rank and influence the powerful. For the youth, Joan's young age does not exempt her from fulfilling a significant destiny. And for the patriot, the pucelle signifies the vehicle to bring national unity. Her story is compelling for many reasons, and I believe it will continue to inspire us for another 600 years. So, we have some time for discussion or questions.
Wow. Well, I'll start it off. So, if I remember correctly from all my reading, basically the only charge the English and Burgundians could really make stick was that Joan dressed like a woman, like a man, wearing armor, even though a former church court at Orleans had given her permission to do so under extenuating circumstances. But by that point, she was just a political expediency and had to go. So they're like, well, okay, fine. She's got to go. We don't care that the earlier church court gave her permission to wear armor in battle.
Right. As you mentioned, so we saw there were several charges brought against her, but that seemed to be the biggest problem that people had an issue, or at least her judges had an issue with the notion of cross-dressing, that was
even though she had
God's word.
A church court at Orleans had given her permission to do so, but don't bother us with facts. We've already made up our mind. And the more I read the trial transcripts, I mean, we're talking about the Luc Besson movie, where you don't really know if she's crazy or not. The trial transcripts, if they're recorded faithfully, she doesn't come across as schizophrenic to me at all.
Right. So, to me, we see her eloquence, as I said, in responding to her judges. Again, considering her background as an illiterate teenager, not really having any upbringing education-wise, it's astounding to me how she responds to the judges.
I did a program on Joan for the Renaissance Fair 20 years ago. Terry Pace did one on Joan of Arc in the movies, and I did the historical Joan. And somebody said, well, what about those visions and what about the miracles? I'm like, as a Protestant Christian, I just have to suspend my disbelief and accept them at face value. And she doesn't come across, again, as schizophrenic at all to me.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that as a Protestant, I feel like maybe we're more inclined to believe or to think she could have heard from God. But think about Joan being in a Catholic tradition. That was not her place to hear from God, right? That would always come through the priest if you were receiving a message from God. So
unless you're a mystic like St. Bridget or someone.
Right.
But here's this.
Even then, though, the regular everyday Joes, Catholic Joes, nobody would listen to them. And even if they were a nun like Catherine of Siena, they wouldn't. And then the three children in Portugal, nobody would believe them. And then, of course, the famous one, Guadalupe. The Archbishop said, well, you got to bring me something. Make sure that this is not the guy down under talking to you.
Right.
So,
and the church was, I mean, people think the medieval church was gullible, but they really had standards. They didn't just accept anybody that claimed they'd seen a miracle. They really tried to authenticate whether this was true or not.
Right. And that's why we see Joan kind of going through a series of steps of trying to prove her authenticity so that Charles knew that he could believe her and support her, and then the church as well, kind of so that she could get her backing before she could even go to the battlefield, right?
At the end, she just became a political liability. She did what she was supposed to do. Now I'm king, so now let the English and Burgundians have her.
Well, it's not like they had photographs of him circulating either, that she was able to pinpoint him.
Right.
Not having seen him.
That's the miraculous story kind of associated. And I wonder if that is part of the reason why Charles does begin to believe her, right, at that point, because she picks him out.
In the Sobieski miniseries, that's one of the key things that convinces Charles, because she picks him out of a crowd and doesn't know him from Adam. She goes, that's him.
Doesn't Shakespeare reference her in one of the Henry VI plays?
Yes, he does. He does. My good friend, if you're interested in that, my friend Gail Orgelfinger has written a book on Joan in the English imagination, where she looks at how British authors have focused on and used Joan in their work. So Shakespeare is one of those. I think it's Henry VI, but she is a character and not kind of well portrayed, of course, because he's writing from the English perspective, right? But she is.
So there are no statues of Joan in England.
Not likely.
Probably not, certainly not as many as in France, but I'm curious. I haven't been back to England in a few years, but she seems to pop up in most places, so it's interesting.
That's interesting.
I'm curious, kind of your coming to the talk, what were people's experience with Joan as far as maybe where did you first learn about Joan of Arc or hear about Joan of Arc? I don't know if that was in school or in one of these movies or...
Actually, there was a film, anthology movie. It was The Devil and an Angel Judging Mankind, and there's one sequence where they're showing Joan, but they're showing her at her execution, how humanity often punishes their visionaries.
Well, I saw the Ingrid Bergman movie as a kid, and I was asking my mom, why are they burning her? What did she do? And she said, well, they're burning her. I think my mother said they're burning her as a witch, which wasn't technically right. But
I think that's actually where the footage came from.
yeah, and now as a medievalist, I'm interested in the medieval history, so anybody interesting like Joan I read about. But my first thing was like TBS, they did that Ingrid Bergman film.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, wow, this looks interesting because the guys with the swords and stuff. But why are they burning that woman?
And you'll find some of these classic, like Turner Classic Movies will replay the Passion of Joan of Arc, the Dreyer film, and different ones like that you can catch on TV.
That's really cool.
I saw the Wishbone movie as a child.
Oh, did you? So
Yeah.
you saw it on Wishbone.
Yeah.
Right.
And then just kind of growing up, my family's Catholic and from New Orleans, so
Mhm.
she's kind of a figure
Right.
in the background.
I think she's kind of like some of those semi-historical figures like King Arthur and Robin Hood may or may not be real, but each generation, each group reinterprets that figure to suit their social, economic, political, whatever they're doing.
Mhm.
Joan can be all things to all people.
Right, that's kind of what I feel. As I said at the end, like she's got this broad public appeal where we find something we can latch on to, regardless of where you're coming from. Eli?
I know I was also introduced to her as a witch at first. I remember I didn't have any sort of like cool movie experience. I was in high school. I was doing this project where we were told to do like some research project. And at the time I was interested in stuff like the Salem witch trials. So when I heard that there was a witch on the list, I was like, oh cool. So I went through the names. I looked her up and found out she's just a knight. What's good about her?
Right.
This is no witch. Get this out of my way.
She was accused of, but she was not, right?
Yeah, but afterwards I was like, oh wait, she was tried as something that people conflated for a witch, and that's sort of where my interest began.
And she, correct me if I'm wrong, she's the only condemned heretic to actually be granted sainthood.
Right. Essentially, yeah, as you mentioned, she was the only person that was condemned by the church and then later canonized by the church.
Rehabilitated in the meantime, but people kind of skip over that.
That's right.
I mean, I didn't even know about that till I really started reading the biographies.
Yeah, and it was the trial was reopened or actually brought up because of Charles was one of the ones who wanted to reinvestigate, which I guess in a lot of ways it would bring validity to his, appointment as the new sovereign, right? If he can justify that Joan was,
Because if she
Having
goes down as a
divine
heretic, then that sort of casts
right, that
aspersions
reflects,
on.
exactly that
yeah.
reflects poorly on him. So the case is reopened, and also thanks to Joan's family and her mother were the ones that brought it up, and but again, this was probably 25-ish years later. She was
In 1456 or something like that.
At which point the 100 Years' War is over. There's politics to be gained by.
Yeah, Charles is king now. That's not going to change. So let's just prop this up and sort of backtrack and smooth out all the rough edges.
Well, in order for her to have been beatified and canonized, she had to have some miracles. And
That's
she
right.
does.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, all of that has to be documented as part of the
So
process.
now you're thinking these
Yeah.
people are probably going, I guess she wasn't a heretic. Duh.
Mhm.
Because she was able to, these people were able to have miraculous cures through her intercession.
Mhm.
Well, to me, the whole trial was just political expediency.
Well, yeah.
We don't care whether she's a saint or not. She's in the way now, so we got to get rid of her.
And she's dressing up like a man. She's
Yeah.
not supposed to be doing that.
Well, I think that was political too. I
And
mean,
the
they
English-
ignored that the church court at Orleans had given her permission, because if you're going to lead troops in the battle, you've got to have armor on if you don't want to
Exactly.
die.
I mean, you think about the practicality, she needed to be wearing men's clothing.
And she
in
got
order
permission to do it,
right,
but that's
to do her job.
another inconvenient fact. Let's blow
For
over
the
that.
English, it
She's a
was-
liability and she's got to go now.
For the English, it also would have been a case of getting even. Here's someone who's humiliated in a battle.
Oh yeah,
multiple
it's
times.
total political expediency.
So-
She's got to go one way or the other.
We need to discredit her, and
She was already becoming a cult figure anyway, so we got to cut this off before it gets any further.
Okay, yeah, it was a pro-English court too, so,
Yeah.
Right.
not the French religious court,
Right,
because
exactly.
they would have said, why were we even bothering
Right.
with the
Yeah,
English?
the archbishop that presided, wasn't he Burgundian?
Yes, I think you're talking about Pierre
Yeah.
Cochon.
So he had no real vested interest in, because he's in the pockets of the English and Burgundians.
Right. And you see a lot of this even in the Luc Besson film, The Messenger. You see kind of what looks like the corruption in the courts and how they're, like you're saying, it's
Well,
expediency. We've got to get Joan out of the
Well,
way.
even the guy who didn't raise his hand at first, and he's getting the look,
Yeah.
and he reluctantly raises his hand.
Mhm.
I'm outnumbered.
Right.
Nothing I can do, because he knows if he holds his stance, he loses position in the church.
Mhm. Right. The pressure to conform. Yeah. Other comments or thoughts that Joan has inspired?
I thought it was interesting that she was beatified the same year that women's suffrage happened in the U.S.
That is interesting. I hadn't made that connection. Yeah. And I was curious because I was looking at why did it come up in 1909 for the beatification, and then much later, as we were saying, or a few years later, in 1920, the canonization. And there was a bishop of Orleans at that time, so the mid 1800s, who was kind of the one leading the effort to look at getting her beatified. And it was also because during that time as well, there were some secular historians who were writing about Joan, and I think that kind of revived interest in her as a figure. And so then it kind of turned, and folks were starting to look at, we should explore that. And
Well, the
so,
feminist movement was just starting to really ratchet up anyway.
Mhm.
But I wonder, in Burgundy, how many churches are there with statues of Joan?
That would be interesting.
If they've said, "Oh, we were so wrong. How could we do that?"
Right.
Road trip.
There you
Yeah,
go.
your next vacation trip.
That's right.
go to
Well, we do
Burgundy.
take a study abroad trip. UNA, we go to Paris, and so that was a photo of the famous Ingres painting. So our students, we go to the Louvre, and so I was able to teach a class on Joan of Arc in Paris. And so we got to go look for all of these memorials to Joan throughout the city. But I also included myself in the photo just so you could see the scale of the painting. It's one of my favorites. So when we go to the Louvre,
I thought it was funny that one pastry is hot pastry, John Dark.
That's right. Oh no! Right.
That is interesting.
But speaking of, there are trips, there are groups. I mean, you could search online and join with a group that does like pilgrimage to these places, like the different cities. So not only Paris, of course, but you could go to Domremy, Vaucouleurs, and kind of make your journey along, like in the steps of Joan of Arc. So that
I'm
is
sure there are
something that
lots of
people do.
pilgrimage tours that do the
Mhm.
circuit every year,
Mhm.
kind of like going to Compostela or Canterbury,
That's right.
do the Joan tour.
But it comes back to what's the appeal of Joan of Arc that so many years later she's in pop culture,
Mhm.
figuring. She's appealing. You even have, like you said, public television.
The
Put her as a
Simpsons.
character. What is
Marge
what is
Simpson.
it about Joan of Arc?
That's right.
You know you've arrived if the Simpsons are ripping you off.
Well, yeah, you've arrived.
And even actresses, if you've seen some of these recent actresses like Zendaya, who dressed up for the Met Gala, she was in like a Joan of Arc dress. And so you'll find like all of these young starlets who finding inspiration in Joan of Arc. So it's quite extraordinary.
Wasn't there like a Joan of Arc haircut? I think Gene Seberg had.
Yeah, the Joan, like the bob
Yeah.
cut. Yeah, exactly. It was a hairstyle as well.
When they shaved her head for the trial, but to wear the arming cap and then the mail and then the helmet, you can't really have long flowing hair anyway to get the armor on.
Right,
And
and,
then
some of the
they
statues that we
yeah.
see depict her with this long.
They want her to
like
look
within the
feminine,
case.
but you
Yeah.
really can't have all that hair under an arming cap and then the helmet.
Right.
But they're doing idealized images of her, and then they shaved her head at the trial for humiliation purposes.
And that's also a really powerful scene that you get in the Dreyer film. So I encourage you to, in fact, I think the whole film may be available on YouTube that you could watch as well. But that's a really powerful scene where Joan's head is shaved, and just the actress Renee Falconetti does an incredible job of emoting.
Yeah, I've read critics say that's one of the best, greatest, most impactful Joan movies ever made.
Mm-hmm. It really is.
Wow.
Greg,
I think
did you have
Gene
another
Siebert
comment?
I was gonna say for the Chapel Run performance, it's
Yeah.
really rooted in like it has nothing to do with the song, but it's kind of the empowerment of yourself.
Yeah.
Is what in the queer community, she's a very, I don't want to say caricature, but she's a
Mm-hmm.
large symbol for lesbians and trans people.
Mm-hmm. Right, and kind of being a rebel or going against what is accepted.
Being
Yeah.
yourself despite
Right.
the standard.
Right. Other thoughts or comments? I also wanted to thank the library for this opportunity and to the Alabama Renaissance Fair. I appreciate you guys coming out on a Sunday afternoon. And my email address, if you want to continue the conversation, just scoker1@UNA. I'd be happy to chat more about Joan of Arc. But merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was great, very good. I could sit here for hours,
Oh, I
as
know.
tired as I am. Thank everybody for coming. I do just want to remind you about the Alabama Renaissance Fair, which will be this weekend, Friday and Saturday, at Her Majesty's Royal Park and Game Preserve Fountain on the Green. So come, or Saturday and Sunday. See, I'm still tired from last night. So everybody come out to the Renaissance Fair this weekend at Wilson Park, aka Fountain on the Green. Again, thank Dr. Coker. This lecture series is, to quote Kermit the Frog, how we try to raise the intellectual level of the program. We do the open forum on the Muppet Show, which would usually end up with Miss Piggy karate chopping the guest star. But Kermit would say we're trying to raise the intellectual level of the program. So we've definitely done that today. Very informative and entertaining. So thank everybody for being here. Oh, it will be available. Chris will edit this and get it on the Alabama Renaissance Fair Facebook page. I think if Dr. Coker would like a copy, we can make that happen.
All right.
So I was hoping V.C. Clemens would be here also to film it, but he and his wife are out of town. But Chris got it. So Christopher's one of our Renaissance Fair people, and Mav, she's Duchess Mav, former queen. Our monarchs can only reign 1 year, so I had to figure out how that works, and so I thought there's a curse.